effects of violence on the residents of Chicago. Alex Kotlowitz will be here to talk about his new book, An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago. How does an island nation survive in a dystopian hellscape of rising seas? John Lanchester will be here to talk about his new novel, The Wall. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Alex Kotlowitz joins us now to talk about his new book, An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago, reviewed this week on the cover of the Book Review. Alex, hi. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You know, before we even begin to talk about the subject of this book, which is very present day, I want to start with a book that you wrote several books ago that came out in 1991, There Are No Children Here. I think everyone who read this book, and obviously many people did, it was a huge bestseller, were kind of permanently touched and struck by that book. It's just one of those books that doesn't go away. It's a great title. So I would say, explain first that title and a little bit about that book.
Sure. I spent 2 years with these two boys, Lafayette and Farrow, who at the time when I first began hanging out with them were 12 and 9 years old, and they lived in a public housing project on the west side of Chicago. And I had never been in public housing in the city. And I will say that when I first visited, I felt this incredible deep sense of shame. Like, how is it I could not know? I mean, it was literally just a mile and a half from my office, which was then downtown. And then just felt this kind of welling anger at sort of how we treated this group of people that were living in what were really horrific conditions. So I spent these 2 years with Lafayette and Farrow, and when I began the project, because they were so young, of course, I needed the permission of their mom. And so I went to her and told her what I wanted to do. And
were you working for a newspaper at the time, the Chicago paper?
Yeah, I was working at the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, okay.
And so originally I did a story about Lafayette, about a summer in his life, which is what led to the book. And then I took a leave from the paper. But when I went to their mother to ask whether it would be okay for me to spend this time with their children and what I wanted to do, she kind of got it right away. And she said to me, it sounds like a really wonderful idea, but there are no children here. And I think what she meant by that, of course, is that indeed there are kids, but that so much is bearing down on them, that they have so many responsibilities and obligations and worries that their childhood feels incredibly fleeting.
Your relationship with Farrow continued after you wrote that book. And you start this book with that relationship.
Right. It did. I mean, one of the things I love about my work is that, many of the people, not everybody, but many of them become a part of my life and my family's life. And I feel so much richer for it. And that was certainly the case with Farrow and Lafayette. And yeah, after the book was done, Farrow loved school, and he was really studious. And his apartment, there were a lot of people coming in and out. It was really hard to study. And I was single at the time, and he asked if he could move in with me for a few days to kind of catch up with his homework. And a few days turned into a few weeks, and ultimately into 6 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And was there a formal kind of guardianship relationship there?
No, we had signed papers from his mom that allowed us to take him to the hospital or doctor if we needed to. Mm-hmm. But she was completely on board with the idea. I got married. My wife, bless her heart, was, embraced Farrow and took him in as well. And so he was there. He lived with us through high school. And
what happened then, and where do you begin this book?
So this book begins at a moment when Farrow was about to graduate. I actually had graduated, and it was a summer. He was going to Southern Illinois University for college. And my wife and I and our young daughter came back to New York, where I'm from, to visit my parents. And Farrow would usually come back with us, but he wanted to stay to get ready for college. And late one night, this is before cell phones, after midnight, I get a phone call from a detective, Ann Chambers, who I knew from my time working on There Are No Children Here. And she's standing in our kitchen, and she tells me that Farrow had just witnessed a murder, and they had worries initially that he had somehow set it up. Farrow had taken a taxi home from our house to visit his mom, and when he got there, two men yanked him out of the cab, and they get into the cab, and one of them ends up shooting and killing the cab driver. And Farrow witnesses all this. And very quickly, Anne, the detective, realized that Farrow, in fact, had nothing to do with it. She knew him from her time in the projects. And the next day, I tried to get in touch with Farrow because I can only imagine what that experience must have been like. And I can't reach him. I'm calling his mom. I'm calling friends. And finally, he calls me back that evening. And I say to him, where have you been? He's been shopping for clothes all day. And I think to myself, if it was me, I'd be curled up on my couch in a fetal position. And I think to myself, something's wrong with this kid. And I realized that it was his only way to deal with this experience was to try to compartmentalize it, push it away. And so the story in that opening is, a few years ago, I'm with Farrell for lunch. I'm talking about this incident that happened 20 years ago. And he gets up at some point from the booth we're sitting in, and his eyes widen, and it's clear he's in that moment. He's reliving that experience. And I had to actually yank him by his arm to get him to sit back down in the booth. And for me, it was this moment when for me, it just was really brought home how the violence so gets in your bones.
How did he articulate it in that moment?
It wasn't so much that he was reflecting on it as much as he was recounting the moment. And it was like he was reliving it. It was like he was crouching down to when he heard the gunfire. And it was really like he was present 20 years ago.
Going back to that sentence in the title of the first book, There Are No Children Here, I mean, it seems like a lot of the themes that connect this book has to do with what the effects of violence really are like. That it's not that you become inured or that you're indifferent or that you're not affected by it. What is it like?
This book is a collection of stories. These really, I think, very intimate and somewhat surprising stories of people emerging from the violence and trying to reckon with it. And it's about what the violence does, how it shapes them, how they fight to keep it from defining them. And I think one of the things, as you allude to, that we've completely underestimated the impact of the violence on the spirit, both of individuals and the spirit of community. There's this sense that somehow, as you say, people get numb to it, they get hardened to it, they get accustomed to it, but they don't. It stays with them.
So this is a subject that has stayed with you. With There Are No Children Here, you had a kind of very clear framework to work within, right? You have two main characters. You have this very set landscape, the projects. How did you approach it differently here?
I think about this a lot as a storyteller. With There Are No Children Here, I had this really clear through narrative. I mean, it was a story about Lafayette and Farrow, and I think you want to keep reading because you want to know what happens to them. It's really what stories are all about, is you just want to know what happens next. And with this book, it's structured very differently. It's 14 different stories. Some of them course through the summer. Some of them are self-contained. It was clear to me, I knew this from the very beginning in working on this book, that I really, in order to capture what I hoped to, I needed the breadth of stories that are in this book, the breadth of experiences. So there are, stories of a mother who ends up forgiving the person who shot her son, a young man who shoots somebody at the age of 18 in an act of vengeance, and about trying to forgive yourself for it. And there's a little trickery of time going on in the book because the way it's laid out is by date. And so you enter that date and every story begins on that day. And then you go back, and I go back and tell the backstory. And then the stories unfurl, some of them a year or 2 years later. And then I kind of yank you back. It's like going into this portal.
That's a lot of characters, too. 14 characters, even, then going in and out of the time frame to juggle that and all, to bring it all together.
Yeah, it was a handful. And for the first time, I've never done this before. I actually bought a whiteboard so I could sort of map out the book, because it was hard to sort of maintain all those stories. And there are 14 stories and actually many more characters than 14. So it's a lot of people to sort of keep in my head. I really struggled with it. There was a moment when I couldn't figure out how I was going to organize this book. I thought, my God, I'm going to have to write this epilogue that's going to be half the book. And my dear friend, the cartoonist, Chris Ware, Chris just said to me one day, we have dinner pretty regularly, and he just said, you just need to sit down and tell the stories. And that's what I did. And that's what sort of got me through.
Well, that was the name of one of his major books, right?
Right,
it was
Building Stories. Yeah.
So he's one who knows. You said two different things. One is epilogue, and the other is that with There Are No Children Here, you had to know what happened to these kids. So before we jump again to the present book, I do want to go back and ask what happened. Where are Lafayette and Farrow today?
So I don't talk too publicly about it because it was, when I was working on the book, it was so clear that I was there to share their story publicly. In fact, I made a point when I was those 2 years, I never was with them without having my notebook out because I never wanted them to forget why I was there. Because for them, to be honest, that from the very beginning, they could have cared less about the book. They just wanted to make sure that I was going to be around once the book was done.
Why?
Well, I think for them, it was the friendship that was important. And I understand that.
It's a really tricky thing to have to navigate as a journalist, as an author, as a, human being.
Yeah, it is. And they were kids. So
Yeah.
but I made a commitment to them that I was going to stay around. That was, I felt that it was important to them, and I was spending all this time with them. But yeah, Lafayette and Faro have become very much a part of our lives. They're now 43 and 40. And
wow.
I know,
no, don't say that.
I know.
Can't
I know.
even...
Makes me feel old. Do you think it makes you feel old? It
Yes.
makes me feel old. And they're doing okay. It's been a struggle for some. In fact, we had a wonderful book party in Chicago last week to celebrate all the people in An American Summer. And Faro came, and it was just really nice. Everybody wanted to meet him, and he's struggling but doing okay.
Which summer is it that you write about? What's the
It's
time frame here?
2013, a fairly arbitrary summer. It was a summer that I just happened to stumble into. And in fact, by Chicago standards, a reasonably tame summer in terms of the numbers.
And yet, Chicago kind of stands out in the sort of larger national narrative that we hear now, which is that violent crime is somewhat down in the big cities, that certainly it's down in New York, with this major significant exception, or there are some exceptions, and Chicago is one of them.
Right. Well, there are a number of exceptions. I mean, in some ways, L.A. and New York are the exceptions. They're the ones where the violence is down. Everywhere else, they're still grappling with this stubborn persistence of the violence. And as bad as it is in Chicago, it's not even among the top 10 in murder rates in the country. And the summer that I write about, the year I write about, that there were 415 homicides. And, at the end of the summer, which I talk about in my book, there was this sense from the mayor and the police chief that kind of mission accomplished. And then 2 years later, the numbers almost doubled. There were 795 homicides in the city. We are still, I mean, we're having a mayoral campaign underway in Chicago.
Yes, I want to talk about that a little bit.
But it's the single most issue, I think, for the candidate.
It is right now, the violence and the crime.
Oh, absolutely. Violence and crime and the relations between the police and communities of color, yeah.
And you have let's just talk about it since it's here, two candidates right now in a runoff. Very interestingly, William Daley of the famed, Daley dynasty in Chicago did not make it into the runoff. What are the positions of those two candidates, Lori Lightfoot and
Tony Preckwinkle?
Yes.
Yeah. So I got to say, I had this experience the day after the election that not dissimilar from what happened after Trump was elected. And, after Trump was elected, I think like many, I woke up and I just thought, my God, I don't know this country the way I thought I did. And when I woke up the next morning in Chicago and these two African-American women, two progressives, one of whom is gay, I woke up and I just thought, man, I didn't know this city.
Very different narrative from the 2016 election.
Right.
At least.
Much more encouraging
Yeah.
one. Tony Preckwinkle has a long history as president of the county commission in dealing with criminal justice issues. In fact, one of the stories in the book is a story that was brought to me by somebody in her office. And then Lori Lightfoot has, this history. She was Rahm Emanuel's appointment to head of the police board. And I think Lori's story is one of transformation. I think she's actually been transformed by her experience and sort of looks at the city and the violence and police relations very differently than she might have 20 years ago. So I'm excited about the campaign.
It's interesting that she comes from Rahm Emanuel's administration, right? Because he sort of left office not too popular in Chicago.
Right. But just to be clear, there's not much love lost between Rahm and Lori Lightfoot.
Why does this situation persist in Chicago? I mean, is it something inherent to the city's, infrastructure, to the history of policing? Why is it I imagine fundamentally tied to the terrible segregation that continues.
Right. And again, I want to be clear. I mean, I could have done this book in Baltimore and New Orleans and Philadelphia. I mean, I chose Chicago because it's my home. It's where I'm at. And it's been so stubborn and so persistent there. The commonality between all these neighborhoods where all this violence takes place is that these are neighborhoods that are deeply distressed. And I think one of the things for me that's really sobering from writing There Are No Children Here 28 years ago and is how little things have changed.
What hasn't changed? Because those projects, right, those projects have been torn down?
They have. In 1999, the city began this really kind of audacious and bold plan to tear down all the public housing high-rises in the city. And anybody who spent any time in those complexes knows they should have come down a long time ago. So they did that, and they did it all very quickly. But we haven't provided the housing that was promised as a part of that plan. And you go into these neighborhoods and they're still reeling from the 2008 housing crisis. I mean, one of the stories I write about this young man, Thomas, I mean, there was at any time that I visited Thomas, there were 3 to 6 abandoned properties on his street. And that has a really deleterious effect on the sense of community. And it certainly makes the terrain ripe for the kind of violence we see.
You brought up Thomas, and his story is just heartbreaking. Who is Thomas?
I met Thomas when he was a junior in high school, and Thomas was kind of almost the Zelig of the violence in this one community in Englewood. I mean, when he was 10 years old, he had been at a surprise birthday party for a friend who was killed by a stray bullet while he was at the party. And as a junior, he's on a porch with his best friend, this girl, Shikaki Asfi, and somebody comes out of the gangway and starts shooting, and Thomas is with Shikaki as she is dying on the front porch.
Violently.
Oh, they're all right. They're
mean,
all incredibly violent. I mean, but it unmoored him. I mean, it just, as you can imagine. And so Thomas, like so many people that I met, I mean, the pain is just kind of bottled up. He's unable to talk about it. But the beauty of his story is that there's a social worker, Anita Stewart, who has taken him under her wing, and Anita has had her own set of traumas in her life, and so she sees some of herself and Thomas. And so Thomas's story is about this really beautiful relationship and about his decision whether or not to testify in the trial of the person who shot and killed his best friend.
Thomas, obviously, you're meeting him, and he's older than when you met Pharaoh and Lafayette. But what are the parallels there in terms of both what they experienced and how they processed it? I mean, did it feel like kind of frozen in time?
No, I think what you see in the young people like Thomas who've experienced this violence is, not unlike what I saw in Lafayette and Pharaoh, not unlike what we see in veterans returning from combat. This sense of anger, sometimes this rage, this inability to sleep. Thomas, who, for example, self-medicated himself by smoking marijuana. This kind of constant anxiety, this hypervigilance, this sense that there's not much future, inability to concentrate. I mean, all the things. I mean, but the big difference between a Thomas and somebody returning from combat, of course, is that there's nothing about the post-traumatic stress because it's consistent in their lives. And there's a moment I write about in the book. I spend, the course of 3 years with Thomas, and he's as I follow him in this court case, and over time I was, taking notes, and I'd go back. I at the end went back through all my notes, and I guess I wasn't really listening closely, but I realized there were all these moments when he told me about somebody who'd been shot or somebody who'd been killed who was close to him, and the numbers just, and I tally it up at the
How much
at
was
the
it?
end. Oh, I think he must have lost 6 friends to murder over the 3 years that I spent with him.
Wow. You talk again in this book to children, to victims, but also to convicted murderers.
The book is actually mostly about adults. I mean, there are a couple of young people, Thomas and Marcello, but mostly adults. And one of them is one of the stories is a story of this gentleman, Eddie Bocanegra, who is I've come to know really well and just really admire. And at the age of 18, Eddie, in an act of vengeance, best friend of his is shot and paralyzed, and Eddie goes out and kills somebody in a rival gang, and he ends up serving 14 years in prison. And his story is really a story about trying to find a way to forgive yourself for what you've done. And one of the things that Eddie has done is he's devoted his life to trying to undo some of the wreckage that he caused when he was younger. I mean, and the other part of Eddie is both his brothers served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and at one point when he's in prison, his brother comes back from Iraq and who was suffering from PTSD, was drinking, was just angry, unable to focus. And he's talking to Eddie about his experience, about what he's feeling. And Eddie's thinking to himself, that's me there. So Eddie now is working with young people and trying to get them to be much more self-aware about what they're experiencing.
It's like being in a form of combat all the time.
Yeah.
You also spoke with police officers, obviously coming at this from a very different angle. Did that change your own perspective on what you've been seeing from the side of the victims of violence and the perpetrators?
I mean, one of the things I did when I was working on the book, I ended up that summer embedding with a homicide unit. I ended up not writing about it in part because it felt too familiar. But it really informed my reporting. I mean, I realized what they're up against. And there is a story in the book that involves a detective I got to know in a case in which a 19-year-old boy, Romain Hill, is shot, and it's meant for somebody else. And Romain does something absolutely remarkable. He actually not only IDs the shooter, but he also agrees to testify. And as a result, the shooter ends up pleading and gets 15 years. And in that subsequent year, Romain undergoes all these threats from friends of the shooter to recant his testimony. And Romain's, he works at a meat department at a local grocery store. And on one day, he's walking to the store, and in a very gentrified neighborhood on a Saturday afternoon, somebody walks up behind him and assassinates him, shoots and kills him. And there were all these witnesses. And so I had heard that the detective in the case was really angry about this kind of no-snitch culture in the streets. And I come to meet with this detective who was just a wonderful man. The department wouldn't let me quote him, which he was upset about. But he actually wasn't upset about that. He actually told me that everybody he met who had witnessed that murder, and they know exactly who killed Romain, was afraid. They were fearful. And of course, given what happened to Romain, they were fearful for their own safety. And he said, I completely understand it. If it was me, I would probably do the same thing. And there's this kind of unmitigated fear in Chicago. And part of that is a consequence of the police's inability to solve crimes. I mean, we have a closure rate in the city of homicides that's under 25%, which means you got a pretty good chance of killing somebody and getting away with it.
How does that compare with other major cities?
It's considerably lower than a lot of other cities. So we've got a lot of work, and it's, I think, one of the first things that our new mayor is going to have to grapple with.
Let's talk about that because, as we mentioned earlier, there are two candidates right now. They're in a runoff. The runoff election is scheduled for April, for next month. I mean, what are these two women proposing? Obviously, Lori has experience within the police.
It's unclear, to be honest, with the differences. In fact, next week, where there's I'm a part of a forum where we're going to get to question the two candidates about these very issues. And, these are both candidates who have been deeply enmeshed in the criminal justice system. I think are both progressive. I mean, Kim Foxx, our prosecutor, who's this incredibly inventive and creative and progressive prosecutor, comes out of Tony Preckwinkle's office. And I know from my conversations with Lori Lightfoot that she was deeply, deeply affected by the shooting of Laquan McDonald, that it really knocked her off balance. It kind of upended some of the things she thought she knew. And so I think that either of those candidates will be one of the first things on their plate.
This book is not a policy book. This is a book of very human stories and about the impact of all of this violence and just danger on people's lives and their relationships. But all that said, from what you have learned reporting out this book and in all your previous work, what is it that you feel like you want those candidates or whoever does become mayor to bear in mind, that outside of policy, but the way that the policy affects people?
As you say, I'm very upfront at the beginning of this book. It's not a book about public policy, and it isn't for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, it's not my forte. Two, that I felt like if I wrote about public policy, that it would be outdated within 6 months to a year. And I feel like there's a real place for storytelling. It's what storytelling does is it brings us places we otherwise wouldn't go and introduces us to people we wouldn't meet. And kind of, the centripetal force of storytelling, of course, is empathy, is this ability to sort of imagine yourself as someone else. And empathy is also the centripetal force of community. It's what connects us. And God knows we're at a place in time in this country when we lack empathy. And so for me, the power of narrative is it lets readers find their own way. And so my hope is that people will read this and begin to rethink what they thought they knew, and that it gives some humanity to the people living in these neighborhoods. Look, there are things that I would do. I mean, one of the first things, as I alluded to earlier, is, again, the commonality in all these communities is that they're just so economically distressed. I mean, the playing field is so unlevel. And so I think, and this seems so self-evident that I almost hesitate to say it, and I think the real question is, where's everybody been? And then I feel like the other part of it is that we need to grapple with this personal and collective trauma in these communities, which we have not so much as acknowledged.
I think if you prove nothing else, you prove that these stories are not outdated, and that the empathy that you have with their characters that you then generate in your readers is eternal, because all of us, again, are still caring about Pharaoh and Lafayette from There Are No Children Here. I'm sure we'll be doing the same with the characters, the figures in this new book. Alex, thank you again so much.
Pamela, thanks for having me.
The book again is called An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago by Alex Kotlowitz. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. John Lanchester joins us now from London. His new novel is called The Wall. John, thank you for being here.
Hi, Pamela. Thanks for having me.
So this book begins with a very scary premise. Tell us what The Wall is and what it surrounds and why.
I'm glad you used the word premise, because that was sort of how it came to me, that there's one central premise to the book, and then when I was writing it, I was sort of unfolding that premise. It's to do with climate change. And it's to do with the idea of a world that is about 4 degrees Celsius warmer, say about 8 Fahrenheit, 7 to 9 Fahrenheit, that sort of thing. And if you look at that online, you see maps of a world that's almost inconceivably different, with huge parts of what's currently the most densely settled places on Earth being essentially uninhabitable. And that's the world of The Wall. It's set in an island in northern European waters. I live in Britain, so you can probably guess what the inspiration is. And because of rising sea levels and the need to keep out the displaced millions of people from other parts of the world fleeing, there's a wall all around this island, a 10,000-kilometre long wall. And every citizen of this country has to spend 2 years standing guard on it, as a term of what is, in effect, is a form of military duty, and as what they call defenders. And so you spend 2 years standing guard on the wall, and if someone gets over the wall on your watch, you are put to sea in turn as a kind of punishment.
So this sounds like a nightmare, but I understand that the idea came to you as a kind of recurrent dream, which is, very purposeful of you to take your dreams and turn it into a book.
It's a dream I had when I was writing another book. I was, and indeed still am, part of the way through this completely other novel. But as you said, I did have this sort of recurrent dream about someone standing guard. I didn't know standing guard, actually. That's to run ahead of myself. It was just a figure who sort of was and wasn't me, standing guard on this wall in the cold and the dark on his own, with the water on the other side of it. And that was the germ of the book. So I think wondering, well, who is this person? And I quickly realized that was actually a question about. The real question wasn't who he is. The real question was, what is that world? What's happening around him? And I realized that I was really dreaming or imagining a world after this catastrophic climate change.
I want to go back to the other part of that origin story, the novel that you were in the middle of, because your previous book, Capital, was a kind of big, sprawling novel looking at the economy and property bubble. And this is a very taut, fast-paced little book, The Wall. I didn't count the pages. So were you in the middle of sort of another one of these very large, sweeping works of fiction, and then this just came to you and you had to do it? How did that happen?
I probably shouldn't be using the present tense, because I haven't gone back and looked at it until this book is sort of properly out and having its life in the world. I thought if I tried to work on it while I'm also talking about The Wall, I might accidentally go insane. So I actually haven't looked at it. And it might be that it's keeled over and died, because that can happen. So using the present tense, it's sort of in the middle, I suppose. It's not quite as sprawling as Capital, and it's not quite as focused as The Wall, but it is a book with more than one point of view in third person. So technically, I suppose it is. I envy writers whose books are technically similar and variations on a theme, and I really like reading books like that. But I find I sort of can't do it, that they just come out for reasons which aren't under my conscious control. My novels just are different from each other. I feel as if a novel has to be about something that preoccupies you in ways you can't quite explain. If you can explain why you're interested in something, I often find like you can't actually write about it. It preoccupies you in ways you can't explain. It bugs you, it nags you, it won't leave you alone. And then once you've written it, it's sort of gone away. That's the way it works for me. And that's
It's like a temporary illness.
a temporary illness, or I tend to think, is it Bluebeard's Castle, that thing about, the locked room at the top of the house that you're not allowed to go in? And that's for me, a novel is like that room. There's something charged and secret and weird and sort of scary and therefore fascinating about it. And the process of writing the book is going into that room and living there for a bit. And then after that, it's as if the door's open. There's no secret there. And by the same token, for the same reason, there's no reason for going back.
Well, then it's all the more curious that you were able to, in the middle of this energy of this other novel that you were working on, kind of be able to shut that door and then take this other route and start working on the wall.
There's this aphorism that the French writer La Rochefoucauld came out with. He said, death, like the sun, cannot be contemplated directly. And I think climate change is a bit like that. I think it's such a big, overarching, terrifying subject, and it leaves you with this sort of deep sense of, it's easy to despair and it's easy to feel that there's nothing we can do, that we have no agency over it. And therefore, I have a natural instinct, in a sense, is not to think about it. And I've done some sort of reading and research on it, and I tried to keep up with the science over the years, but in a way, that's not the same thing as actually being able to think about it, because it's sort of unbearable. And I think what happened was that I was unconsciously processing it, and it sort of forced its way to my attention in the form of a dream. I mean, it's never happened to me before, and I don't expect it to happen again. But I think the fact of not being able to think about it, and the fact of it having kind of popped out in a dream, I was for a while thinking, well, those are actually completely opposed things. And I suddenly realized, no, that's actually the same thing, that because on some level I had been brooding on it, that's why, in a sense, it emerged fully formed.
You work as a journalist and also write nonfiction. Was it easier to grapple with climate change, which is, as you said, very difficult for people to kind of face down? Was it easier to do that in fiction than in those other forms for you?
Yeah, definitely, because, I've written one single piece about climate change more than 10 years ago. And as I say, have sort of tried to keep up with it in terms of the science. But it's that thing about being very hard to look at directly, and it takes me anyway, I think it takes a lot of us to a quite dark place in our heads. And I think that what I hope is that it's easier to make people sort of dwell on the subject, face it, inhabit it, process it through story. That wasn't a conscious intention, but that's actually the way it's turned out for me, that I've sort of engaged much more with it in fiction than I've been able to in other forms. And I think that's, in a sense, because of the narrative can do that. You can lead people by the hand to a place where otherwise it's quite hard to get to.
Of course, this book isn't really just about climate change. In the title alone, obviously, calls to mind certain other things going on in the world, in particular in the UK and in the US with Trump and the border, and in the UK with Brexit. I'm assuming all of those kind of figured into this pretty harsh dystopian landscape that you've conjured up.
Well, the funny thing is, they weren't in my conscious mind. They were what was going on around me while I was writing the book. But I started it in early 2016. I would have confidently gone out and bet the value of my house against Donald Trump being the next president of the United States. And it was before he'd even mentioned the war. In fact, somebody fact-checked that for me just the other day, and he didn't mention it first until June, and I was in 2016. I was already writing it. But when you look at it, graphs, charts, economic things, there's a solid line leading up to the present, and then there's a dotted line often stretching into the future. And I was thinking about that dotted line in two areas specifically. One, trends in our climate. We don't change. We don't get lucky with how the science works out, and we keep pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, and the worst case scenarios come true. So that's sort of one of those dotted lines is about the climate. And the other dotted line was about trends in our society, which I did see in terms of society and politics, a kind of turning in and start to cut off and, put up walls, put up barriers, turn away from each other. Brexit was being debated, but we hadn't ended up where we are now. Trump was, I think, running for president, but nothing else was obvious. But the dotted lines did continue. So it's, in one way, it's a gigantic coincidence about Trump's war, and in another sense, though, perhaps it is, travel along the same axis, travel in the same direction that I was imagining.
Nonetheless, I think you are the latest bit of evidence in the developing theory that the fiction writers were the only ones to predict Trump's election in 2016. I'm curious, in certain ways in the book, you avoid sort of specificities of exact time and place, right? You set this period of the change very much after whatever climate catastrophe precipitates it. You don't name the country, this island nation, although one presumes it's Britain. Is this a particularly British story, do you think, or did you try to kind of keep that vagueness to universalize it or say something else?
I did want to universalize it. I deeply don't think it's a national story anywhere. That's the sort of nature of it. And I suppose I sometimes get asked if there's a link with Brexit in the book, and I think the point is that Brexit is kind of local and probably temporary because all the young people are against it, and has an element of black farce about it. So local temporary farcical, and climate change is global, permanent, and desperately serious. It would be wonderful if it weren't universal, if you see what I mean, if it were just a sort of local issue. I was consciously blurry about the timescale because it's easy to get slightly distracted by, the various timescales of the various predictions. The short answer is that we don't exactly know how the timescales will play out. But I thought it's not so much after a period of time as it's after a specific event. As you say, I call it in the book the change, and it just is this thing, the shift to 4 degrees centigrade warmer world, which unfortunately some of the dark versions of it, can happen really fast, happen within a generation or two. And that's the decisive thing about the chronology of the book, is that before and after, rather than questions of exactly how many decades have gone past.
With your previous novel, Capital, and understanding that these are very different books, the kind of phrases that people used to describe it were a social novel and a satire, and the terms that come to mind with this are dystopia and speculative fiction and science fiction. And I'm curious how you feel about those kind of terms and those sort of genre definitions as it applies to this work.
I'm perfectly happy with any and all of them, and I would wear any of them proudly. They weren't really in my mind when I was writing the book, partly because I was sort of thinking of it from the inside out, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Not as well what it looks like, but what it feels like to write. And the only thing I'd say about dystopia is that in a weird way, maybe that's too optimistic a term, because it implies an element of, as it were, consciously making everything worse and trying to imagine what that's like. And I don't know, is it that remote from the path we're on? As he said at the top, it's a premise, and in a funny way, the work of writing the book was almost not like the work of fiction. It was like a slightly different thing. It was like accept one premise, accept one huge premise: 4 degree warmer world, island in the northern Europe, off the Atlantic. What's that like? What are the consequences? How's life changed? How's society changed? How do people feel? What's their day like? Who are they? What's the world like? That it was almost like a non-fictional premise, and then the imaginative work was trying to unfold and unpack it and see where it led. And in a funny way, that's a slightly scarier thing than dystopia, perhaps.
All right. Speaking of what one's day looks like, I want to ask you a kind of technical, mechanical question, because this is something that I've heard about you, and I want to know if it's true or false, and then you have to explain it. And that is that every day you stick to a word count of 500 words of fiction, 1,000 words of nonfiction, and writing 1,500 words of journalism. True or false?
Wholly false, but ever so slightly true. In that it's not every day, it's only when I'm writing. That's quite a big qualification. I mean, I wrote today, actually, but that's by no means always the case. And it's one or the other. So if I'm writing a novel, it's 500 words. If I'm writing a piece, or if I'm writing a sort of non-fiction book, of which I've written 3, that's 1,000 words. And if I'm writing journalistically it's 1,500, but those aren't ands, those are ors. And, it's only when I've got going. I do try and the thing about the fiction target is it sounds low, but for me, the secret is having quite a low target that I know I'll hit, because at 500 words, you don't have an excuse for not doing that.
Right.
You set the bar so low that, a toddler could accidentally fall over it, and therefore you can't let yourself off. So I'm pretty ruthless about that one. Once I get started, I keep going until I finish. But the other ones are a bit more demanding, but they're also, you don't have to keep them up for as long.
Coming from someone who's as accomplished as a writer as you are, that is tremendously reassuring. So thank you for that answer and for the book. John, thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you very much.
John Lanchester's latest book is The Wall, and it's reviewed this week in the book review by Alec Navala-Lee. Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Jumana Khatib, Greg Coles, and John Williams. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hey. All right, let's start with you, John, because you're going to pick up from where you were last week.
Yeah, I've gotten out of starting the last couple of weeks, I feel like, so it's my turn again. I'm going to start by tying the knot on Hilary Mantel's memoir, Giving Up the Ghost, which I talked about briefly last week, and I finished in the interim. I'm reading a string of remarkable memoirs. The next one I'm going to talk about is also a memoir. This book it's funny how little it's about, really. It's about partly her childhood and these things that happened to her, these sort of visions she had, and then growing older and becoming a writer and a researcher. And it's about religion and Britain and Ireland. And it's also very much eventually about sickness, because she was diagnosed after years of indescribable or undiagnosable pain with endometriosis, and later she had severe thyroid problems. And so she went from being a very gaunt, younger person to very overweight, and she describes all of that and the ways in which she feels in her body. But there is a strange spectral feeling to the whole memoir, and there's this incredibly brief passage I'll read because it pivots from what she's been writing about to this moment she has when she's 7 or 8 years old, she says, in the backyard one day. And this is before she tells you what actually happened. And it goes to show that she doesn't really know exactly what happened, and yet it changed her life. She says, "Sometimes you come to a thing you can't write. You've written everything you can think of to stop the story getting here. You know that technically your prose isn't up to it. You say then, very well, at least I know my limitations. So choose simple words, go slowly. But then you are aware that readers, any kind readers who have stayed with you, are bracing themselves for some revelation of sexual abuse. That's the usual horror. Mine is more diffuse. It wrapped a strangling hand around my life, and I don't know how to name it. I don't know what it was." And then she goes on from there. So that's a little tease of the Hilary Mantel memoir. And then I moved on to this book by Edmund White called My Lives. And it's actually the first full-length book of his I've read, the novelist and memoirist. The book was recommended by our colleague Parl Sagel to me, who has incredible taste, as you might imagine. And it's structured in a really interesting way where the chapter titles are My Shrinks, My Father, My Mother, My Hustlers, My Women, My Europe, My Master, My Blondes, My Genet, and My Friends. And when Parl first told me that it was structured that way, because it's such a clever conceit, I thought that these would be brief-ish chapters that kind of dove into these subjects. They're each fairly long and incredibly rich, and in and of themselves, a mini biography told through whatever that element of his life is. And I'm about a third of the way through it, and the writing is very clear-eyed. He's great on his parents. He essentially writes mini biographies of them as well. And now he's talking about his early days being gay and essentially finding hustlers in his life and the various people he met from the time he was probably a teenager up until his 30s.
That makes the concept and title of one of his other memoirs, one of my favorites, Our Paris, kind of more poignant, because he went from the my to
that is very
the hour, which was about him and his then partner and their life in Paris together.
Yeah, he's a longtime resident of Paris, so I'm going to get there eventually. Greg, what are you reading?
Oh, I gave up reading for Lent.
Oh, good. Okay, Jumana.
No, I'm just kidding. I've got a couple of books in front of me. One of them I just wrote about in our new and noteworthy section. It's a collection of very brief essays by a poet named Ross Gay. The name of the book is The Book of Delights, and it is just what it says it is. He set himself the project over the course of a year from birthday to birthday. I I think it was right after he turned 42. He set out to kind of notice something every day and appreciate it and write about that as an act of sustained attention and gratitude and appreciation in a world that he recognizes right from the start is filled with things that might lead you to despair and in a different direction. And he writes about some of those things as well, but it's a book that is assiduous in its attention to the joys of living. So they're almost like little mini secular homilies, very attentive, very thoughtful, not at all saccharine.
And pretty much pocket size.
The book itself is pocket size. The essays, some of them are not even a page long. Many of them are in that kind of 2 to 3 page sweet spot. Almost like little journal entries. So that's something that you can pick up and make your way through almost at random. It doesn't have any kind of sustained narrative.
It sounds like a nice thing to maybe read one each day for the year, the way he wrote it, because I could use a year full of joy. I want to meter it out.
And then the other book that I'm reading now is also it's a new novel. I am on the record, if social media counts as the record.
It does.
Opposing time travel narratives. I think that they are, in general, a cheat, narratively speaking.
What about in movies?
Yeah, also just not a fan. I feel like the stakes are lower anytime that you take away that one-way street.
So it's not like the logistical inconsistencies that trouble you.
No, it's the whole
larger
cause and
philosophical
effect. I feel like where narrative derives its power is because you can only go in one direction and one thing leads to another and it just becomes more and more like, oh no, don't do that. But if you can go back in time and change things, then you're taking that away.
You're so strict, Greg.
So moral.
I know.
This book, The Heavens by Sandra Newman, is a time travel narrative of sorts. It's more of an alternate reality narrative. It takes place in 2 different eras. One is leading up to 9/11, so essentially current day New York, and the heroine is named Kate. But in her dreams, possibly, she's living another life as a woman named Amelia in Elizabethan England, where she encounters William Shakespeare and she becomes the mistress of a nobleman. And the things that happen in that world, in the Amelia world, seem to have some bearing on the present day reality. So it gets into this whole butterfly wings science fiction aspect, or the sliding doors kind of alternate realities, branching realities.
This is like 100% in my wheelhouse. FYI, for contrasting view.
And the time travel stuff or the difference in time, it feels very much to the point of the book. It doesn't feel like a cheap device because it's exploring these questions, partly of mental illness. Is she schizophrenic or crazy, or is she in fact living in these alternate worlds? And also just kind of the nature of time. In a way, it put me in mind of the Alan Lightman novel Einstein's Dreams, which plays with different notions of what time is, and is it circular or spiraling, and or linear, the way that we experience it. And so it's got all of that going on. But what I'm really responding to in this book is the writing itself. It's got a very clear prose style. It's almost journalistic. So it's telling this fantastic story, like fantasy story, in a very clean prose that goes deep psychologically. The relationships are great. The stakes do feel highest in the contemporary world more than in the dream world, partly because it's our world. And partly because it feels more real.
You've completely contrasted our taste in books, because for me, the thing that just cemented my interest was the possibility of insanity. All that. And for you, it's the clear writing.
Yeah.
Shumana?
Well, I feel like the ear of the bunch today.
Only one book?
Not only that, but so all the books that I'm reading right now are about death and grief and other timely feelings. So I'm reading right now Francisco Goldman's sort of like fictionalized memoir or very autobiographical novel called Say Her Name, which deals with the grief of losing his young wife after like 2 years of marriage. She died really unexpectedly in a body surfing accident in Mexico. And I mean, the way he frames it is pretty amazing. I mean, even from the opening page, it's sort of framed almost like a murder mystery, right? And he talks a lot about the difficulty he had with his in-laws in the wake of his wife's death, and they suspect him, and they blame him for the death. And Goldman is a novelist and a reporter, and he brings all those skills to bear in sort of examining what it's like to sort of go from being this woman's husband to not. And it's completely heart-stopping, but the writing is really beautiful.
I remember when we reviewed that in the book review, it was on the cover, and the art was also really haunting.
I remember when she died, she was a rising young poet and with a kind of a building reputation. And so her death came as a shock in the poetry world, in the writing world.
What was her name?
Aura Estrada, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. And I mean, he went on to found like a literary prize for young women who write in Spanish in her name. And I mean, he did sort of find ways to carry on the legacy. But it's such a beautiful testament because he really pulls at whatever's available to him to try and understand her inner life. And it's a very loving project. And she sounds amazing. I mean, the thing that's so heart-wrenching about it is you want to know this woman.
It sounds heartbreaking. Pamela, you're in the throes of the LBJ years still?
I am. I've got about 200 pages to go. I made a mistake, actually, last week, which I want to swiftly correct, which is I said that this book, Master of the Senate by Robert Caro, came out in 2012. It did not. It came out in 2002. And then the fourth volume, The Passage of Power, came out in 2012. So we are now 7 years post fourth volume and awaiting the fifth. What's interesting to me in the section that I'm reading now is I'm still trying to grapple with something I mentioned on the last podcast, which is the question of Johnson's character. You know, who is this person? Is he ultimately a heroic figure in any way? Because right now he's villainous. And where I've gone since that last episode is that at least understanding him as a man of contradictions. I don't know if it's going to get resolved. But on the one hand, he had incredible compassion and empathy. You know, there are two different kinds of people who I think get very influenced by whoever they're talking to. One is whatever the other person is saying, they kind of absorb and agree with. Then they can go into a room with someone else with totally contradictory views and find the same thing. That wasn't Johnson. What happened with Johnson is that whoever he was currently talking with, he actually completely aligned with them on his own. It wasn't that they were influencing him sort of directly and acting upon him so much as that he was almost like an empath, that he just absorbed whatever story he was hearing at the time. And so there are these accounts of incredible compassion on his part as a young teacher in his 20s, teaching Mexican-American children on the border of Texas and really feeling for their plight of these poor immigrant children and the poverty and the hardship of their lives and trying to improve it. But what happens again and again is that when Johnson's compassion comes into conflict with his own personal ambition always wins out. The ambition always trumps his compassion. And that's still a puzzle that I'm not sure if that's going to stay there until the end. But the ambition certainly is something that runs through this book. And the section that I'm in now is fascinating because it's the election of 1956. So you have Eisenhower running again. He has had a heart attack, 2 serious health crises. There's a question of whether he is going to even run again. Ultimately, he does. And he's hugely popular, but he has this obstacle. And then on the Democrat side, Adlai Stevenson, who has a sort of full force of the Democratic Party behind him. And then Johnson, who somehow gets it into his head that he has a ghost of a chance in this election. And there are a few things happening at this time that are so different from the political landscape of today. One, this is a period in which the conventions actually mattered, where things got decided on the first ballot, second ballot, sometimes many ballots later. And two, that the political parties were not split along ideological lines. So you had a conservative wing and a liberal wing within the Democratic Party, and you had a conservative wing and a liberal wing within the Republican Party. And the situation that is most relevant here is what's going on in the Democratic Party, because this, for Johnson, is the kind of real challenge that he has to overcome in order to win nationwide office, which is that he's coming from the South. It's the conservative South. They are firmly against civil rights. And then you have liberals in the North. And up until this point, it is a given that you need the solid South behind you in order to win electorally on a nationwide level. However, it has just begun to dawn on both Democrats and Republicans that the northern Black vote in the cities is great enough to overcome the South. And that in the long run, if either party doesn't capture that vote, they're going to lose. So for Johnson, this is a huge challenge. He's coming from the South. He has the South entirely behind him. He has stood against civil rights at every possible moment in his career up until that point. And in order to win, he has got to persuade liberals who are truly set against him on the other side that he is not their enemy. And for a brief moment of total really delusion, he thinks that he can do it in 1956.
It's interesting because I don't know if this is where you were going with it, but that makes it start to seem like instead of character, he's just this very practical operator. And so when a more philosophically liberal or moral position about civil rights presents itself as a way to victory, he'll grab it.
Exactly.
Right. It was ambition and not ideology that led him to kind of his progressive views.
He is the ultimate operator, the ultimate vote counter. And what begins to dawn on him here, not quite yet, but you can see that he's going to realize this, is that to his mind, civil rights is a pragmatic kind of issue, and the people who are in favor of civil rights within the Democratic Party are the people he thinks of as the crazies in the party. And he does not understand that for them, this is a moral issue, that they are impassioned, idealistic, and that it's not just a matter of their vote, their sort of ledger of votes are going on the opposite column. It's that if you are not with them, then there is something deeply wrong and problematic with where you stand. And he is not, at this stage, accustomed to being judged by ideology. And so the section I'm on coming up to this 1956 election is that, once again, civil rights legislation has finally made it into Congress. It has passed through the House, and if it comes to the Senate, Johnson, as majority leader, is going to have to be in the position of either being for it or against it. And because he is trying to balance these two needs to win the election or the nomination in 1956, he cannot be seen as having any opinion on it whatsoever. And so he goes all out to try to prevent this bill from coming from the House to the Senate. And the machinations by which he goes through in order to prevent it are completely fascinating and almost, I want to say, like medieval. It's a process that in a digital age could never happen, because it actually involves like someone running through the streets of Washington with a piece of paper and people physically trying to block him and people going through various passageways and having voice counts by. And I'm not going to reveal all the details, but it's that level of kind of like on the street maneuvering
that
in the
reminds me
Senate.
of scenes from the film Lincoln.
Yes.
It makes me think that the internet changed things more in the last 20 years than we did in the last 200 years.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is really, in many ways, it's a totally different world. Again, you have conservative Democrats, liberal Republicans. No longer you have conventions that actually matter and are not just kind of, show rallies. And you have, people running around physically preventing other people from doing things. So it feels like a world away. And yet, at the same time, as I mentioned, last week, the race issue is just as ever present. So that's it for me. Shimana, quickly, what did you read?
I read Say Her Name by Francisco Goldman.
Greg?
The Book of Delights by Ross Gay and The Heavens by Sandra Newman.
And John?
2 memoirs, Giving Up the Ghost by Hilary Mantel and My Lives by Edmund White.
And mine was Master of the Senate by Robert Caro. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague, John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.